The courtroom fell silent the moment Robert Blake leveled his gaze at Judge Monroe and declared, "She's unstable. She lies to our daughter. I want full custody." In that instant, Helen Carter felt her world shrink. Her breath caught. Her voice vanished. And all she could do was watch as the man she once trusted painted her as a threat to the little girl she adored. Behind her, 7-year-old Grace Carter sat clutching her grandmother Margaret's hand, wide-eyed and unnerved. Yet, while everyone else saw only the polished suit and practiced composure of Robert, like a seasoned executive delivering a keynote, Grace quietly plotted her own intervention. What no one knew was that the creaky, 2-bedroom, 1-bath apartment they shared, with its cotton candy pink curtains and beloved bedtime ritual of 2 storybooks under a single lamp, had also witnessed louder moments, whispered phone arguments in the next room, surprises of lasagna at the door from Grandma, and countless entries in the truth jar that Helen introduced after her divorce. Those nightly notes, sometimes as lighthearted as, "Why do people snore?" and sometimes as piercing as, "Will Daddy still love me if I stay with you?" reminded them that honesty was the only shield against fear. Now, on this crisp Monday morning, Grace was ready to prove it. Clutching the small tablet she'd borrowed from her school backpack, she would soon stand before the judge herself and turn the tide with a single video that revealed Robert's true face one no suit or courtroom drama could disguise. Helen Carter sat bolt upright in the stiff, wooden courtroom chair, her pulse hammering like a freight train through her temples. Across the room, Robert Blake, her ex-husband, leaned forward in his navy blazer, his face calm and composed as if he were delivering a keynote address rather than accusing his child's mother of being unstable. Every time she tried to open her mouth, only a shallow gasp escaped. Her lawyer sat impassively beside her, offering no lifeline. Helen's hands trembled on her lap, the polished oak armrests cold against her skin. The judge's gavel had barely settled when Robert began. "Your Honor, Mrs. Carter has repeatedly lied to our daughter, Grace, and I fear for her emotional well-being. I'm requesting full custody." His voice was steady, free of hesitation, and carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. In that moment, the courtroom felt smaller, the air thicker, and Helen could practically see her future empty weekends, fractured holidays, and the widening distance between her and Grace. She remembered the sound of Grace's laughter echoing through their 2-bedroom apartment on Saturday mornings, the pink curtains fluttering like candy floss in the breeze. She remembered Margaret, her own mother, showing up unannounced with a casserole in a Pyrex dish, wiping the counters and whispering, "You're stronger than you know." Those memories pulsed behind her eyes now, fueling a desperate urge to speak, to defend herself, to rip apart Robert's carefully constructed facade. But the words wouldn't come. She felt trapped by the judge's expectant gaze and the silent scrutiny of every person in that hushed chamber. Robert's lawyer slid a stack of documents across the table: emails, text messages, notes taken out of context, all meant to reinforce the narrative of Helen as a scattered, over-emotional parent. Robert's performance was flawless, the supportive father who never raised his voice in public, the professional who met deadlines on time and smiled through client presentations. In contrast, Helen, freelance graphic designer by day, exhausted single mother by night, looked every bit the frazzled underdog. Behind her, Grace sat clutching Margaret's hand, her knuckles white. Helen glanced at her daughter's wide eyes, saw the silent plea there, Mom. "Please." She could no longer pretend that the judge's bench was just a piece of furniture. It was an arena in which her voice and her daughter's future hung in the balance. Just as Robert opened his mouth to add another polished point, Helen felt Grace shift in her seat. Everything in the courtroom seemed to pause, as if someone had pressed stop on the soft hum of the air conditioner for the first time. Helen realized she wasn't entirely alone in this fight. Her daughter was watching, listening, and if her grandmother's reassuring smile meant anything, ready to act in that heartbeat of silence. Helen found a sliver of resolve. She squeezed Grace's shoulder, reminding herself that, come what may, she had to believe in the truth of her own story and in her daughter's courage to tell it. 7-year-old Grace Carter knew better than anyone how her father's polished exterior masked a volatile temper, so she did what her mother, Helen, had always encouraged. She prepared. The previous Saturday afternoon, after Robert Blake's calm facade had given way to whispered tirades in the living room, Grace slipped her small pink tablet from her backpack and pressed the record button. It wasn't the first time she'd heard Dad's angry voice rising in the dark. It was the 5th. But this time, she felt a responsibility heavier than her stuffed penguin, Pepper, tucked under her arm, as Robert accused her mother of lies and threatened, "Try telling anyone and you'll end up in a foster home." Grace's hand shook only a little, just enough to remind her how important it was to capture every word. Back in their 2-bedroom apartment on Maple Street, the pink curtains fluttered like candy floss clouds in the afternoon light. Helen was in the kitchen, tapping away at her laptop, graphic designer by trade. Devoted mother by heart, unaware that Grace was at the threshold of something both frightening and necessary, the truth jar sat on the coffee table, a mason jar nearly full of folded notes, questions scribbled in tiny handwriting. Like, why do grown-ups yell and is fear louder than love? Grace had always believed that if words could hurt, then words could also heal. On that Saturday, as Helen replayed carousel slides of bedtime story snapshots, Robert's volume crept up the hallway. Grace pressed her ear against the door, heart pounding like the old radiator in winter. She heard him muttering about unstable, manipulative, danger labels he wielded to frighten her mother into silence. In past visits, Grace had retreated under her blanket. This time, she reminded herself of her mother's nightly lesson, honesty is the bravest choice. When Robert stormed into the hallway, demanding to know where she was, Grace clutched the tablet behind her back. I thought you needed to hear what you sound like," she said, voice small but steady. He saw the screen lit up and lunged, but she stepped out, pulled her mother into the frame, and whispered, "Record this." Helen's eyes widened with fear and pride as Robert's face twisted from practiced charm into raw frustration. "You're betraying me," he snarled, but the tablet captured every syllable. That evening, Helen reviewed the footage in the glow of the living room lamp, tears mingling with relief. There was the unmistakable proof the man who greeted judges and clients with a steady smile had a darker side he never showed. Grace sat beside her, knees drawn up, whispering, "Maybe now they'll believe us." Helen nodded, hugging her daughter tight. On Monday morning, as the courtroom hushed at Robert's opening remarks, Grace clutched her grandmother Margaret's hand. In her backpack lay the tablet, quiet evidence of a child's bravery. When her mother faltered under the judge's gaze, Grace rose, stepped into the aisle, and held the device high, Every senior person in those polished wooden pews leaned forward as the judge tapped play. For the first time, the courtroom heard Robert's true voice, harsh, threatening, unmistakably cruel. Silence fell like snow. That single act of recording changed everything. The judge's eyes, once indifferent, widened as Grace's recorded words filled the air. If you tell, you'll live in a foster home, no longer a frightened child. Grace became the bearer of truth, and because she dared to record what no one else would see, her mother's voice was finally heard and justice began to tip in their favor. When the hush of the courtroom settled after Robert Blake's polished opening, Helen Carter felt the walls close in her voice still trapped in her chest, her hands trembling against the smooth wooden bench. All eyes were on her, yet she had nothing to offer. Across the aisle, Robert sat back in his navy sport coat, arms folded, a satisfied gleam in his eye. He had built his case on his practiced charm and a stack of out-of-context emails that portrayed Helen as erratic and untrustworthy. The judge's gaze was expectant, Mrs. Carter. "Do you wish to respond?" But the only sound Helen could summon was the sharp intake of her breath. Behind her, little Grace Carter shifted in her seat, gripping her grandmother Margaret's hand so tightly that Margaret's knuckles went white. Helen had noticed Grace's stillness, her tense posture. It mirrored her own fear, yet Grace's dark brown eyes, wide and unwavering, also held something else: determination. Helen dared to glance back at her daughter and saw a small nod. Grace's way of saying, "I'm ready." When the judge opened her mouth to speak, Grace quietly slipped from the bench. In her hand was the pink school tablet she'd borrowed earlier that morning. The clerk's scratching pen and the low hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade as Grace walked the length of the aisle, her sunflower print dress swaying like a small promise of hope. A collective murmur rippled through the spectators. "Your Honor," Grace said, her voice clear and surprisingly steady for a 7-year-old. "I brought a video from my dad's phone. I think you should see it." The courtroom froze. Robert's confident smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of panic. The bailiff frowned, uncertain whether to intervene, but the judge simply inclined her head. Grace handed over the tablet as if passing a torch. Helen's chest tightened. The moment she had longed for and dreaded had come. The judge tapped the play icon, and Grace took a step back to stand beside her grandmother. "On the recording." Robert's voice filled the room again, but this time without his polished courtroom veneer. She heard him say, "You decide to tell. You end up in a foster home. Don't think your precious mother can save you." The flat echo of the video contrasted sharply with the lush acoustics of the courtroom, underscoring the menace behind his cultivated exterior. A single gasp emerged from the gallery, then another. The judge hit pause and held the silence. "Where did you get this?" she asked. Eyes on Grace. "Dad left his phone on the couch." Grace replied softly, "I recorded because I was scared, and nobody would believe Mommy." The judge exchanged a glance with Robert's attorney, whose normally composed expression now betrayed concern in that charged stillness. Helen felt her lungs refill for the first time in hours. The evidence was undeniable. The same man who had commanded respect with every measured word was revealed as the source of Grace's fear. The judge stood, her posture suddenly authoritative. "We will make this part of the record," she said, voice carrying through the room. "Temporary custody will remain with Mrs. Carter until further review, and Mr. Blake's visitation will be supervised." As the gavel fell, A collective release swept through Helen. Her daughter's bravery had shifted the scales of justice. Grace returned to Helen's side, slipping her small hand into her mother's, and Helen realized how priceless that clasp was. In the gallery, strangers offered nods of empathy. Outside the courtroom doors, Helen would breathe freely again, at least for today, secure in the knowledge that truth, once spoken, could not be silenced. The courtroom fell utterly silent as Judge Monroe tapped the play icon on the small tablet that Grace Carter had bravely handed forward. In that moment, the polished veneer Robert Blake had maintained since stepping into the room shattered into jagged fragments. The video recorded just days earlier in their modest two-bedroom apartment began with the low hum of the living room's overhead fan and the soft click of Grace's pink tablet camera activating. Then came Robert's voice, rich and measured at first, as if he were still delivering that carefully rehearsed opening statement. "You think you're so smart. Huh." But almost instantly, the tone shifted. He leaned closer to the camera, his expression darkening. "Go ahead. Try telling anyone," he snarled, voice rising. "See what happens." The judge's eyebrows lifted. Across the bench. Helen Carter felt her pulse spike. Memories of that Saturday afternoon flooded back the way her ex-husband's jaw had clenched, the veins at his temple pulsing with anger. "On the screen." Robert's voice grew harsher. "You'll end up living in some foster home," he threatened, each word a deliberate blow. "And don't think your precious mother can save you. She's pathetic. At home." Grace had watched her father pace the carpet, peppering his tirade with venomous pauses that the camera caught in chilling clarity. Now. Those pauses hung in the courtroom air like unseen weights. Helen's breath caught as she relived the moment Grace, small but unbowed, pressing record while clutching her stuffed penguin, Pepper, for courage, on screen. Her whispered apology. "I'm sorry" was barely audible under Robert's tirade, yet its frail sincerity struck a chord deep within every juror present. The judge leaned forward, silent, absorbing each syllable that exposed the stark contrast between Robert's public persona and his private cruelty. As the video continued, the camera wobbled when Robert reached for the tablet, trying to seize it from Grace's trembling hands, his face twisted with frustration at being recorded. And for an instant, his polished composure vanished entirely. The judge paused the footage on that frame, Robert's eyes wide, mouth open in mid-sneer, shirt cuff rumpled a far cry from the tailored suit he wore that morning. A collective murmur rippled through the gallery. Margaret Carter, sitting near the back, pressed a handkerchief to her lips, tears brimming. Even Robert's own attorney glanced down at the bench, unable to maintain the detached professionalism he'd displayed moments before. Judge Monroe broke the hush with measured authority. "Ms. Carter, please identify this evidence." Grace, still clutching the judge's hand for balance, spoke with quiet confidence. "It's from last weekend. Dad didn't know I was awake, but I heard him talking like that. I recorded it because I thought someone needed to see the truth." In that instant, the balance of the entire hearing shifted. The man who had painted Helen as dangerous now stood revealed as the true source of fear for his own daughter. The judge's steady gaze met Robert's for the first time that morning, and the unspoken question in her eyes was clear. How do you defend this? Without a word, Judge Monroe returned the tablet to the bailiff and announced that the recording would be entered into the record. She then ordered that Helen retain temporary custody and that Robert's visits be supervised. As gavel met wood, a collective exhale swept through the room. Helen rose from her seat, tears slipping down her cheeks, and wrapped her arms around Grace. The little girl, still clutching Pepper, looked up and whispered, "I did the right thing. Didn't I?" Helen kissed her forehead and nodded. "You did more than that. Sweetheart, you saved us." And in that moment, the true power of an honest voice, no matter how small, had rewritten their story. Helen Carter had long since learned that. In a courtroom, truth often goes unheard unless it's neatly packaged and served on a silver platter. So when her ex-husband, Robert Blake, sat across from her in his tailored navy blazer, every inch the consummate professional, she knew she couldn't rely on her shaky voice or her lawyer's cautious prodding to carry her case. Instead, she leaned on something far more concrete, the meticulous record she had kept ever since their divorce began. A compendium of emails, text messages, and handwritten notes that painted a portrait of the man her daughter once called Daddy, and the man he had become behind closed doors. Over countless late nights in their modest two-bedroom apartment, its linoleum floors creaking after dark and its pink curtains glowing like a cloud of cotton candy in the streetlight's glow, Helen had dutifully cataloged every volatile outburst, every cutting remark, every attempt to undermine her parenting. She had saved the email in which Robert accused her of being irrational and unstable, forwarded the text messages where he belittled her cooking and questioned her judgment, even transcribed the voicemail in which he threatened to report her to Child Protective Services for being an unfit mother if she dared challenge his new rules for visitation. Each piece of evidence was organized by date, annotated in the margins with Helen's handwritten observations, the time of day, who was present, and how their daughter, 7-year-old Grace, had been affected. It wasn't an easy habit to cultivate. After all, no one wants to admit that the person they once loved, who had once whispered "I love you" at bedtime and celebrated milestones large and small, could transform into someone capable of weaponizing fear within a family. Yet Helen persisted, driven by a conviction Margaret, her own mother, had impressed upon her during those early, turbulent days that documentation would be her refuge, her constellation of proof when memories alone would not suffice. She kept a green accordion folder stashed between the couch cushions, so that if Robert ever tried to deny his own words, she would have them at the ready. In the courtroom on that crisp Monday morning, Helen quietly drew that folder from her tote as Robert's attorney leaned in, offering yet another admonishment about her emotional volatility. The judge observed the exchange with polite detachment, unaware of the trove of evidence Helen was about to unleash. As the attorney concluded, "Your Honor, these allegations of instability are hardly surprising given Mrs. Carter's scattered conduct in these documents." Helen stood and placed the folder on the table with a steady hand. Every head in the courtroom turned, the judge's pen pausing mid-note. "Your Honor," Helen said, voice calm but authoritative, "I ask that the court review these records, which verify a consistent pattern of behavior by Mr. Blake that undermines both my credibility and my daughter's well-being." She handed over a copy of the folder to the bailiff, who looked momentarily puzzled but complied. Inside were neatly labeled sections threatening texts, contradictory statements, late-night voicemails, and witness notes from neighbors who had overheard raised voices. Each section contained dates in bold, followed by transcripts and screen captures, each item speaking louder than any lawyer could. Robert's composure faltered for the first time that morning as the weight of his own words came into view. His carefully rehearsed persona cracked when the bailiff passed select exhibits to the judge, a string of midnight texts in which he accused Helen of poisoning their daughter's mind, and an email sent to Helen's graphic design clients questioning her reliability due to undue stress at home. As the judge skimmed through the documents, her expression shifted from polite neutrality to focused concern. Margaret, sitting beside Grace in the back row, squeezed her daughter's hand, mouthing, "I told you this would help." Helen returned her mother's glance with gratitude. It had been Margaret who insisted. Numbers and timestamps don't lie. When Robert attempted to interject, objecting that these notes were taken out of context, the judge raised a hand. "Context is precisely what this court needs," she said. Then, addressing Helen, she added, "Ms. Carter, thank you for your diligence. We will include these exhibits in the record and consider them in our custody determination." In that moment, Helen felt a shift as profound as the turning of the seasons. No longer was she the trembling mother unable to speak. She was the responsible parent who had gathered the facts, safeguarded her daughter's welfare, and presented an unassailable case. The folder on the table was more than paper. It was a testament to Helen's unwavering commitment to Grace's safety and a tangible reminder that, in a world of polished facades, honesty backed by evidence could prevail. As the hearing adjourned, Helen packed her folder with care, each document returning to its labeled slot. Outside the courtroom, sunlight warmed the courthouse steps, a silent promise of a new chapter. Helen squeezed her daughter's hand and, with Margaret by their side, stepped into the light, confidence buoyed by the knowledge that truth, once documented, cannot be denied. Helen Carter knew that in the sterile formality of a courtroom, a mother's quiet tears and impassioned pleas often faded into the background unless they were backed by something tangible. So she transformed her home, its modest 2-bedroom apartment with creaky floors and candy pink curtains, into a center of data collection. From the day Robert Blake first began to criticize her parenting in biting late-night text messages, "You're poisoning Grace's mind," he had written at 11:47 p.m. and to leave voicemails threatening to report her for being emotionally unfit. Helen copied and saved every exchange. She filed screenshots of emails in which he disparaged her graphic design work, too erratic for a professional client. He had accused in a missive sent at 9:23 a.m. into a bright green accordion folder, each section labeled and dated, the handwriting in the margins noting the emotional aftermath on their 7-year-old daughter, Grace. Helen even jotted down observations on napkin scraps when Robert raged in person about unnecessary drama as Grace stood silently by, wrapping her tiny fingers around Margaret Carter's hand. Each note recorded the date, time, and context, the squeak of the front door at 2:15 p.m. Robert's clipped command that Grace go to your room, and the way Helen's heart pounded at the memory. She preserved the printed texts, the transcribed voicemails, and the whispered messages overheard by neighbors who later confirmed that yelling is not the same as parenting. When the custody hearing arrived, Helen placed that meticulously assembled dossier on the polished wood table before the judge. As the bailiff distributed the marked exhibits, threatening texts, workplace emails, overheard tirade transcripts, even Robert's attorney paused, caught off guard by the clarity of the record. Those pages spoke louder than any argument crafted in legalese. They revealed a pattern of manipulation and intimidation that contradicted Robert's calm public veneer. When the judge leafed through the compiled evidence, the courtroom atmosphere shifted. No longer was Helen simply a distraught ex-wife, but a responsible parent who had devoted herself to her daughter's safety. The gallery, filled with senior community members in muted blazers and floral scarves, leaned forward, recognizing in Helen's diligent record-keeping the very definition of steadfast devotion. By the time the hearing adjourned, the judge had cited Helen's folder as pivotal in granting her temporary custody, acknowledging that factual. Timestamp documentation can indeed balance the scales of justice in favor of truth. In that moment, Helen's nightly habit of preserving every harsh word and every threatening intimation became the shield that protected her family, an object lesson in how. In America's courtrooms and beyond, the pen or keyboard backed by precise record-keeping can outmatch even the most polished performance. The moment Judge Monroe paused the recording, the weight of the room shifted. Helen Carter felt a tremor of relief ripple through her body as the judge's steady gaze met Robert Blake's for the first time that morning. No longer shielded by polished rhetoric, he sat exposed. The same man who had delivered smooth accusations against Helen was now laid bare by his own voice. Margaret Carter, sitting just behind Grace, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and Helen reached without thinking to take her daughter's hand small, reassuring, certain. "Ms. Carter," Judge Monroe said, her voice measured. "This court will admit this recording as Exhibit A. It will remain part of the official record for our custody determination." The bailiff nodded and passed the tablet back to Grace, who folded it carefully into her sunflower-patterned backpack. Robert's attorney cleared his throat, opening his mouth to protest. But the judge raised a single finger. "Mr. Blake's visitation rights will be modified to supervised only, pending further investigation. And until the final ruling, Ms. Carter will retain temporary full custody of Grace." An audible exhale swept through the gallery. The years of anxiety, the relentless fear that Helen's trembling arguments would never break through Robert's composed veneer, felt suddenly worth it. Strangers in the courtroom, senior citizens in well-pressed jackets and pastel scarves offered sympathetic nods, as if to say, "We believe you." Helen's pulse slowed from a frantic race to a steady beat. Outside the courtroom, the late morning sun glinted off the marble steps as Helen, Margaret, and Grace paused before descending. Grace peered up at her mother. "Mom, did I do okay?" she asked, her voice soft but sure. Helen knelt, smoothing a strand of hair behind Grace's ear. "You were incredible. Sweetheart, you did exactly what was right." Margaret hugged them both. "I always knew that girl had courage," she whispered. Helen glanced back at the courthouse doors, now closing behind them, and felt the echo of those doors slamming shut on an agonizing chapter of their lives for the first time in months. She exhaled fully, no longer bracing for Robert's next move, but savoring a measure of peace. That evening, in the calm of their apartment, Helen set the pink curtains aglow with soft lamplight. Grace pulled her favorite stuffed penguin, Pepper, onto her lap and curled up beside her mother on the sofa. Margaret brought over a casserole in a classic Pyrex dish lasagna, as always, and placed it on the coffee table, over bowls of cheesy noodles. They talked quietly about what had happened. "I'm proud of you," Helen said, her eyes misty. Grace shrugged, a shy smile tugging at her lips. "I was scared," she admitted, "but I knew Mom needed me." Helen reached out and squeezed her hand. "You saved us today," she told her daughter. Then she reached under the coffee table and produced their truth jar, now nearly full of folded notes, pulling out the top slip. She read aloud, "Can bravery be taught? Grace glanced up. "I think bravery is just telling the truth," she replied. Helen closed her eyes for a moment, letting the truth of that statement settle. In their modest 2-bedroom nest with its creaky floors, pink curtains, and nightly rituals, mother and daughter had faced down fear together. And though more legal battles lay ahead, they had learned that no suit or courtroom formality could overcome the simple power of an honest voice. That night, Helen tucked Grace into bed, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Rest easy, my brave girl." As she turned off the lamp and stepped into the hall, Helen knew they would always carry that moment of light and that nothing could dim it now. Before the hush of the courtroom and the sharp rapping of Judge Monroe's gavel, there was a different kind of rhythm in Helen and Grace Carter's life, one set by the gentle creaks of their 2-bedroom apartment and the soft glow of the bedside lamp. That nest, down a quiet cul-de-sac, wasn't much a living room, just big enough for Helen's worn armchair and a thrift shop sofa. A kitchen with linoleum floors that creaked after 10 p.m., and 2 small bedrooms, one of which belonged to Grace. Yet within those pink-curtained walls, they built a sanctuary of love and honesty. Each evening, Helen, freelance graphic designer by day, would close her laptop and gather Grace on her bed. Pulling the fluffy comforter up to their chins, Grace would clutch Pepper, her stuffed penguin, while Helen read not 1 but 2 stories first, a classic fairy tale of brave heroines, and then a new adventure about a child discovering her own courage. The lamp's warm light pooled around them like a cotton candy cloud, and for 30 minutes, the rest of the world melted away. After stories, Helen introduced Grace to the truth jar, a mason jar perched on the nightstand. Every night, Grace wrote 1 question or confession on a small slip of paper, sometimes as light as, "Why do fireflies glow?" and sometimes as heavy as, "Will Daddy ever stop yelling?" Helen never flinched. She read each note aloud, offering answers with gentle honesty. Those nightly rituals forged a bond of trust strong enough to weather any storm. On weekends, Margaret, Helen's mother, would stop by with a Pyrex dish of homemade lasagna and a bouquet of fresh basil. She'd scrub the bathroom tile while Helen prepared Grace's favorite cereal, and they'd all share a simple Sunday meal at the kitchen table. Margaret's visit wasn't just practical help, it was a reminder that family could arrive in casseroles and consoling hugs, too. It was in those small moments, story time, the soft scratch of pen on paper, the aroma of tomato sauce simmering on the stove, that Grace learned to speak her truth, and Helen learned to listen, long before the tablet ever made its way into the courtroom. Their apartment taught them that honesty and love could outshine even the coldest judgment. And it was from this warm, creaky-floored haven that Grace found the bravery to stand up, press record, and change both their lives forever. In the hush that follows every storm, we discover our greatest strength lies in the quiet truths we share. When Helen Carter stood trembling in that courtroom, she wasn't just fighting for custody, she was fighting for the right to protect her daughter's heart and soul. 7-year-old Grace arrived clutching her tablet like a tiny lifeline, ready to reveal her father's harsh words. "You'll end up in foster care if you speak the truth." It was a moment of pure courage, proof that love isn't measured by calm voices or tailored suits, but by the bravery to speak up when silence feels safest. In our own lives, we face smaller battles, gentle tensions with aging parents, worries about our health, or the ache of memories we'd rather forget. Yet like Helen and Grace's nightly truth jar, even the simplest acts of honesty can heal us. Write down your worries, share your questions, read them aloud over a warm cup of coffee or tea. Let every confession remind you that you are never alone in your fears. If this story spoke to your heart, please leave a comment below sharing a time when truth changed your life. Your experiences can light the path for someone else who needs hope today. And if you'd like more real, uplifting stories told with honesty and warmth, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Together, we'll keep telling the truths that matter most.